So first of all, I would like to thank Professor Hagen-Gruber and the team of organizers for putting together this very exciting conference, including so many diverse perspectives on women in philosophy. My own perspective is that of a classicist and literary critic reading various texts as cultural artifacts. What it means is that I read texts not as in works of individual authors, but as objects with which various knowledge communities have interacted. And I develop in this approach in my recent book, Pythagorean Women Philosophers, which came out from Oxford at the end of 2020. Today, I want to discuss a very special and influential genre of writing called apothegms, meaning clever response. Hence my title today, Knowledge Bites Women Philosophers and the Greek Paideia. The question I hope to address is what kind of lessons about women's participation in philosophical inquiry would these short forms impart? I will work towards my answer in 3 steps. First, I will explain how the genre worked. Second, I'll briefly introduce my sample of 3 apothegms by Theano. And third, I'll tease out their philosophical implications by putting Theano in conversation with another philosopher, namely the cynic Hipparchia. So step 1, why do apothegms or responses matter? Ancient philosophy is in fact eminently tweetable. Short quips, such as asked to define a friend, the Stoic Zeno responded another self, featured very prominently in Greek culture. In fact, most Greeks and Romans encountered philosophical ideas through what we call wisdom literature. And these were maxims, proverbs, apothegms, and miniature anecdotes. They were the object of intense reflections. Students would first memorize them, then learn spelling and grammar on them, and finally interpret them in their composition exercises. Adults would always come back to them throughout their professional and private lives. Spelled out next to portraits of sages on elegant mosaics and scribbled on the walls of public bathrooms, apothegms were the most influential form of that philosophical ideas could take in the Greek and Roman worlds. So this is why it is crucial to interrogate this genre and its representation of women philosophers. Now, at first glance, famous responses may appear a hostile terrain. Most of the sages and philosophers whose words were memorized were, of course, unsurprisingly male. Teresa Morgan, in her book on popular morality in early Roman Empire, observes women who, as sex, lacked cultural authority, might study philosophy, but were never revered as sages. As you will see shortly, I disagree with this assessment and find it inaccurate. However, it does reflect a trend that we as historians must face. Mistrust of all women, especially those with any degree of education, was pervasive in Greek wisdom literature. Consider this example. Teaching a woman how to write is like offering poison to a viper. That this warning was attributed to the comic playwright Menander makes it only slightly less depressing. Luckily, among the figures known for their famous maxims, there was Theano, the celebrity Pythagorean philosophers. She first appears in our records quite early, in the 4th century BCE, as the most accomplished of Pythagoras' female disciple. Only later, in the 3rd century, does she become his beloved muse and wife. Around the 2nd century BCE, her apothegms, treatises, and finally letters begin entering the circulation. Her apothegms remained popular for about 1,000 years, between the 1st century CE and the 11th, so up to the Middle Ages. The evidence is rock solid. It comes from literary texts, ancient textbooks for composition, and papyri with ancient students' exercises scribbled on the margins. To translate this into Twitter terms, she was the most followed female intellectual of the ancient world, with the exception of Sappho, and she was definitely a philosopher. So the mere inclusion of Theano among sages is not everything. It is very important to understand what it was that she taught to young men and women. For we do know for sure that young girls, as well as boys, memorize Theano's sayings. The 2nd century CE Greek polymath, Plutarch of Chaeronea, and also a philosopher, recommended Theano to his young disciple named Eurydice, writing, "You should always have on your lips those very sounds of the apophthegms that as a girl you memorized in my house." And this apophthegms means, of course, also apophthegms of Theano. The phrase, "those very sounds," is really important. A few paragraphs earlier, Plutarch warns Eurydice against reading and thinking without male supervision. He compares the intellectual outcomes of such thinking to cancerous tumors. So I hope to demonstrate that the 2nd century male interpretation of Theano is an attempt to obscure the most important, deeper meaning that we find in her apophthegms, which often offer an antidote against the talk of educated viper and cancer. Okay, so step 2, here is my sample. Today we have 8 of Theano's sayings in various Greek sources, but there are as many as 76 in a Syriac translation. I have chosen for today 3 from the small Greek corpus. Number 1, throwing the cloak over her shoulder, Theano revealed her arm. To someone who said, "Oh, a nice arm," she replied, "Not public property." Number 2, Theano advises a woman about to go to her husband to put aside her shame along with the things she wears, and to put them again as soon as she gets up. 3, Theano, the Pythagorean philosopher, when asked how she was going to become famous, responded, "Working the loom and serving my own bed." Now, this does not look promising at first. Theano, at first glance, doesn't offer any insights that would seem to us obviously philosophical. In fact, she appears to enforce rather conservative housewifely values. Plutarch wanted his students to read her precisely in this way. He approved very warmly of the quip on philosopher's arm and lectured his student Eurydice that Theano meant to say that not only the arm of the virtuous woman, but her speech as well ought to be not for the public, for speech may reveal intimate details about her body. Now, I am far more interested in what Plutarch didn't want young Eurydice to see and to think, for there is a striking contradiction between Theano's epistemic authority and the silence that Plutarch wants to impose on his female students. I shall also argue that Theano's message is highly ironic and in fact encourages independent thought. So this is my step 3, looking for Theano's philosophical message. In order to retrieve this message, we must first understand what deeper questions the Pythagorean is really responding to. And for this, we do need help of another woman philosopher, namely the cynic Hipparchia. The anecdotes about the cynic address head-on the question of how a woman may practice philosophy. Before I discuss Hipparchia, an important reminder. Anecdotes and sayings allow us to glimpse the iconic personae of Theano in brackets, and Hipparchia, as they were known to users of Greek culture in Roman Empire. So it's about 1st century AD and later. Such cultural icons are not identical with the historical figures of women philosophers. And this is a crucial distinction because the persona of Theano, whose historical model would have been active in the 6th century BCE, seems to be in dialogue with Hipparchia, who in fact lived 200 years later. Okay, so 3:1, enter Hipparchia. Diogenes Laertius, active in 3rd to 2nd century, so later contemporary of our conservative friend Plutarch, has a chapter on Hipparchia in his Lives and Opinions of Famous Philosophers. In this chapter, he collects a series of earlier anecdotes about first her conversion to philosophy, then education and other achievements. Hipparchia converts to the Cynic philosophy when the Cynic Crates persuades her brother, I always imagine him as a younger brother, but though there is no proof, not to commit suicide. The cause of the suicidal ideation in this case is shame. The young man has disgraced himself by passing gas in public. So this grotesque motif is important because it draws our attention to a very distinctive Cynic theme that bodily functions are natural and therefore cannot be shameful. A Cynic philosopher learns to be free from the feeling of shame based on mere social conventions. When Hipparchia becomes Crates' followers, she takes on a role that blurs the intellectual with the erotic. The disciple lover actively pursues the teacher beloved, like Alcibiades pursuing Socrates in Plato's Symposium. Crates at first rejects her, but finally relents after Hipparchia passes a very peculiar test in Cynic resistance to Aeschine. Crates suddenly drops his cloak and thus stands naked in front of Hipparchia, old and crippled. She is not embarrassed and thus passes the test. Cynic pronounces them partners in this. Crates pronounces them partners in their Cynic lifestyle, and they live in the public view, participating together in philosophical debates. But Crates is very significantly absent from the final anecdote in Diogenes' chapter, in which Hipparchia has to pass 3 more tests. So, as you see, a lot of testing is going on in Cynic education. In the first test of intellectual prowess, she deletes a male philosopher, Theodorus, in a public debate. Infuriated, Theodorus attacks her physically, pulling down her cloak. Now, this second test is no small matter. We have to imagine that Hipparchia in our anecdote doesn't work much under her cloak. This, however, she remains perfectly in control, despite, we are told by our source, being only a woman. Now, her control over her Aeschine further infuriates Theodorus, who now moves from physical assault to something worse, namely sarcasm. He opts for a malicious citation from the play Bacchae by Euripides. In the Bacchae, Queen Agave has murdered her own son. Unaware of this and carrying his mangled remains, he comes on stage boasting to have abandoned her shuttle at her loom in order to accomplish greater deeds. And abandoned her shuttle in order to accomplish greater deeds becomes a famous citation. So, echoing Agawe, Theodorus asks Hipparchia if she, in fact, is the woman who has abandoned her shuttle by her loom. The implication is that Hipparchia's achievements are monstrously wrong for a woman. It is hard to think of a more effective way of undermining a woman's intellectuals. Deluded, she has abandoned not just her loom, but her duties towards her loved ones. Murder is, of course, an extreme case, but any mother who has missed a school play because of work can relate. Now, Hipparchia proudly responds for all of us. Yes, I am this woman, Theodorus. Do you really think that I made a bad decision for myself when I devoted to education the time I would have otherwise wasted at the loom? The anecdotes in Diogenes Laertius prepare the reader of the Lives for the conclusion that Hipparchia has not wasted her time at all. It is really liberating to find in an ancient text the claim that philosophical education is a far better use of a woman's time than domestic chores. Hipparchia, the cultural figure, stands out as an eloquent advocate not just for women's education, but also for equality and freedom of choice. But she has a price to pay. Along with her concern for superficial conventions and eiskine, the cynic philosopher must relinquish the safety and respectability of a conventionally married woman. Hipparchia, the cynic, radical, is an extremely hard act to follow. Just how hard it was for Hipparchia to become Hipparchia, we can learn from another anecdote, this one cited by the Roman historian Cornelius Nepos in 1st century BC. It shows Hipparchia at an earlier stage of her cynic apprenticeship and equates her progress in training with participation in the legendary cynic practice of kynogamia, literally dog's marriage, referring to having intercourse in public. So, citing, it is said that when Crates wanted to lie down with Hipparchia in public, and she pulled her cloak to hide, he scolded her, saying, "Obviously, you still have made very little progress in your training, since you don't dare to do in the presence of others what you well know to be the right thing to do." So kynogamia here dramatizes the obstacles that the female intellectual must overcome if she wishes to function in the public space as a cynic philosopher. Further, Crates' public scolding reminds us that in this space, typically occupied by men, the cynic woman must have a male teacher. Through her protective gesture, without uttering a single word, Hipparchia raises several important questions. Must a woman choose between her intellectual ambitions and her comfort? Must she always learn from men and model herself on men? It is with these questions that I will turn again to Theano. So section 3.2, back to Theano. To begin with the Pythagorean philosopher's comments on her own shapely arm. Throwing the cloak over her shoulder, Theano revealed her arm. To someone who said, "Nice arm," she replied, "Not public property." So the wardrobe malfunction, as we now see, brings up the question of eiskine and places Theano in a situation comparable to that of Hipparchia attacked by Theodorus or forced to have sex in public by her husband. While Hipparchia's modest gesture in the anecdote on kynogamia is halted by her pontificating partner, Theano is in charge in her anecdote, and she uses this opportunity to articulate her own, not someone else's program. Her arm doesn't belong to the public, he teaches. It belongs to her, and she decides who may see it. Hipparchia, the embarrassed apprentice, might concur with Theano, while the emancipated Hipparchia may scorn both her earlier self and Theano for being needlessly prudish. These figures, then, are ostensibly concerned with social conventions that prescribe that elite women's bodies be hidden from the public view. However, since both Hipparchia and Theano are philosophers, there is likely more at stake here than just the visibility of the female body. The exposed body of the woman philosopher brings up the questions of where she can be at ease, who is in charge of her, and whom she may address. Anecdotes about Hipparchia tell a story of gradual emancipation from male tutelage that eventually allows the cynic woman to philosophize like a man in public space. In Theano's comment on her arm, the philosopher thinks, decides, and speaks for herself. But there is a doubt. Does her wish to take shelter against the stranger's gaze also mean that a woman should not be educated or not contribute to philosophical debates? Now, the second saying I would like to discuss suggests otherwise. Theano advises a woman to go to her husband, about to go to her husband, to put aside her shame, eishinne, along with the things she wears, and to put them on again as soon as she gets up. The addressee of Theano's advice here contemplates going to her husband, which in language of Greek sexual ethics means initiating sex. Plutarch has a special lesson on whether a woman should go to her husband or wait. A lady must wait, she advises. Theano recommends the very opposite, that the woman take the initiative, leaving behind the conventions of respectability along with her clothes. But she is to do so only in the privacy of her own bedroom and on her own terms. So what does this pronouncement have to do with philosophy or education? First, Theano's advice to put aside the superficial sense of shame, eishinne, playfully revises the conditions under which a cynic would receive her training and practice philosophy. Second, like the exchange between Theodorus and Hipparchia, Theano's advice displays mastery of literary citation. She in fact alludes to a very famous story told by the 5th century historian Herodotus. In this story, the Persian king Candaules invites a man named Gyges to his bedroom in order to give him the opportunity to see his beautiful queen naked. Gyges protests against this violation of the queen's honor, articulating what was to become a very famous maxim. When she takes off her clothes, a woman also takes off her shame. The concept of shame Herodotus evokes here is different from the superficial shame that the cynics sought to eliminate. Herodotus uses in fact a different word, eidos, not the cynic eiskinne. So what the queen is denied is honor, or the right to be treated with respect. And indeed, when the dishonored queen discovers her husband's betrayal, she takes revenge by persuading Gyges to murder her royal husband. So Theano appropriates, not just cites Herodotus, appropriates Herodotus for her own purposes, subtly and meaningfully altering Gyges' words. Now, this goes, of course, against our friend Plutarch and his insistence that his student should not ever change a single sound from the precepts she memorized as a child. So when she advises the wife to undress in front of her husband, Theano tells her to abandon not her right to be respected, eidos, but her false sense, eiskinne. Theano here is an educator, articulating her own program in dialogue with the cynics. Her disciple is advised to ask like a liberating cynic philosopher, but only on her terms and when it suits her. The husband is expected to value and trust this value her trust and respect her. The murder of the Persian king lurks in the background of Theano's anecdote as a cautionary tale. So Theano, unlike Hipparchia, doesn't make claims about her education, but demonstrates it indirectly. She reaches her audience without occupying the same space, imitating or emulating male philosophers. A woman intellectual, she seems to imply, can teach based on her own female experience without any male instruction. Plutarch would definitely disapprove. But does this mean that Theano embraces domestic bliss uncritically? Let us examine the third and last saying in which she comments on her own fame. Here it comes. Theano, the Pythagorean philosopher, asked how she was going to earn fame, responded, working the loom and serving my bed. Theano then seems at first glance advocate utmost humility. But there are reasons to consider her response highly ironic. When answering the same question, the cynic Diogenes of Sinope apparently claimed that he hoped to achieve fame by paying no attention at all to his fame. Theano is making a similar point. She will become famous by devoting herself to a wife's proverbial duties, the loom and the bed. Her answer is in fact satirical. It tweaks a very famous line again from the first book of the Iliad. There, Agamemnon refuses to return the captive girl Chryseis to her father and tells him that the girl's fate is to grow old as his slave. She will work the loom and serve my bed, he jeers. Theano claims to embrace this despised position of a humble slave woman whose life is spent between the loom and her owner's bed. At the same time, she is calling attention to her education through her clever use of Homeric citation. In contrast to Hipparchia, who rejected the loom along with traditional female duties, Theano jokes that her loom will make her famous. Importantly, she doesn't evoke Penelope, the noble paradigm for a woman made famous by her loom. Rather, she implicitly compares the position of the wife to that of a slave woman, and that thus suggests a whole world of ironic interpretations. Theano then demonstrates both her education and her intellectual acumen while ostensibly praising the loom and with it, women's humble work. Questions and themes derived from anecdotes about Hipparchia's cynic education thus have allowed us to see in Theano's soundbites but a woman engaging with important philosophical questions. Put in dialogue, the two figures seem to present two sides of a debate on the place from which a woman may speak and take part in philosophical culture. Two different proposals available to users of Greek culture in the early empire emerge. One, represented by Hipparchia, echoes in many respects the utopian model of Plato's Republic. In this tradition, a woman intellectual simply emulates men. She receives the same education and speaks to the same topic and works, at least initially, under male supervision. To her, being a female is merely a source of frustration. It makes it more difficult to be unembarrassed in public. Conversely, Theano emphasizes femininity and sexual difference. Her comments on specifically female questions of sexual ethics, dress, and housework serve to validate rather than negate female experience. An educated woman can and should speak from and about her experience as a woman. A woman philosopher can make important points, Theano suggests, when speaking precisely from this position. While she obviously engages with male view, she is not bound to emulate them. In fact, in 2 of the 3 sayings, she explicitly corrects male wisdom. To my conclusions. The 2 figures thus model answers to questions about sameness and difference that we are still grappling with today. Is it the same thing to engage in inquiry as a woman and as a man? If it is not the same, should the difference be reduced or should it be embraced? The cynic denies the existence of the difference. The Pythagorean embraces it. Both sets of anecdotes dramatized valid positions women philosophers would take in antiquity and revealed traces of a very sophisticated debate about women in philosophy. Now, I cannot prove that Greek girls who memorized Theano's sayings at school would find in them truly an antidote against the rest of wisdom literature with its talk of female vipers and intellectual cancer. But we can hope that they did so. And this hope, as I have tried to argue, is a very reasonable hope to entertain. Thank you.